He thought no one was listening, what Frank Sinatra secretly said about Neil Diamond. Behind closed doors in a Las Vegas penthouse, the chairman of the board spoke words that would shock the music industry. Frank Sinatra, the most powerful voice in entertainment, gave his honest opinion about a younger singer who was taking the world by storm. What he said was never meant to be heard by anyone outside that room, but someone was listening. And when those words finally came out, they changed everything. You'll see how fierce competition between two musical giants turned into unexpected respect, how Frank Sinatra's private comments revealed his true character, how Neil Diamond's reaction to what was said showed the kind of man he really was, and how this secret conversation became one of the most important moments in music history. He thought no one was listening, what Frank Sinatra secretly said about Neil Diamond, and the truth will surprise you. It was 1971, Las Vegas, Nevada, the entertainment capital of the world. The Strip was at its golden age. Every major hotel had a showroom featuring the biggest names in music. Frank Sinatra was performing at Caesar's Palace, his home base, the place where he was treated like royalty because that's exactly what he was. The voice, the chairman of the board. Old Blue Eyes, the man who had defined American popular music for 3 decades. At 55 years old, Frank Sinatra was still selling out every show, still commanding the stage like nobody else, still the king. But there was a new kid in town. Well, not exactly a kid. Neil Diamond was 30 years old, but compared to Sinatra he was young, a newcomer. And Neil Diamond was hot, red hot. His songs were climbing the charts one after another. Cracklin' Rosie had hit #1. Sweet Caroline was being sung in stadiums across America. Song Sung Blue was about to become another massive hit. Neil Diamond was selling millions of records, filling concert halls, and getting the kind of attention and adulation that usually took artists 20 years to achieve. He had done it in less than 5. The music industry loves to create rivalries, loves to pit artists against each other, create drama, generate headlines. And the press was trying hard to create a rivalry between Frank Sinatra and Neil Diamond. They were very different artists. Sinatra was the smooth crooner, the sophisticated interpreter of the great American songbook, the tuxedo-wearing symbol of classic Vegas elegance. Neil Diamond was the sensitive singer-songwriter, writing his own material, performing in more casual attire, representing a new generation of musicians who didn't follow the old rules. The comparisons were constant. Magazine articles asking if Neil Diamond was the new Frank Sinatra. Radio DJs debating who was the better vocalist. Music critics analyzing their different styles and declaring winners and losers. It was all nonsense, of course. They were completely different artists with different strengths and different audiences. But the media didn't care about nuance. They wanted a fight. Frank Sinatra had seen it all before, had lived through the comparisons to Bing Crosby in the 40s, to Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. in the 50s, to Elvis Presley in the 60s. Every generation brought new stars, and the press always wanted to know if the old king was threatened by the young prince. Sinatra had learned to ignore most of it, but this thing with Neil Diamond was different somehow, more persistent, more annoying. Part of the problem was that Neil Diamond was actually good, really good. Sinatra had no patience for mediocre artists who got famous through gimmicks or good looks or payola. He had famously dismissed many popular singers of the 60s as talentless hacks. But Neil Diamond wasn't a hack. The man could write songs that connected with millions of people, could sing with genuine emotion and power, could command a stage and hold an audience in the palm of his hand. These were things Sinatra respected because he did them himself. In October of 1971, Neil Diamond was booked to perform at the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas for a 2-week engagement. The Aladdin was just down the strip from Caesar's Palace. The 2 shows overlapped, both Sinatra and Diamond performing in Vegas at the same time. The press had a field day, wrote articles about the showdown, about who would draw bigger crowds, about whether the young star could compete with the legend on his home turf. Neil Diamond didn't play into the rivalry narrative. In interviews, he spoke respectfully about Sinatra, called him one of the greatest entertainers of all time, said there was no competition because they were different kinds of artists. But that didn't stop the press from trying to create drama, didn't stop fans from taking sides, didn't stop Vegas insiders from making it into a contest. Frank Sinatra's close circle of friends, the people he trusted, the ones who had been with him for years, watched all this with concern. They knew Frank's temper, knew his pride, knew that he didn't like being compared to anyone, especially someone young enough to be his son. They worried that Frank might say something publicly that would create real conflict, might lash out at Diamond in an interview or from the stage. That would be bad for everyone. Bad for Frank's reputation, bad for Neil Diamond, who didn't deserve it, bad for the music industry. One of those friends was Jilly Rizzo. Jilly owned Jilly's Saloon in New York, Frank's favorite hangout when he was in the city. But Jilly was more than just a bar owner. He was Frank's bodyguard, confidant, traveling companion, and one of his most trusted friends. Jilly had been with Frank through marriages and divorces, career highs and lows, fights and reconciliations. He knew Frank better than almost anyone. On a Tuesday night in October, after Frank had finished his show at Caesar's Palace, he and Jilly went up to Frank's penthouse suite on the top floor. The suite was massive, luxurious, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the neon spectacle of the Strip below. Frank poured himself a Jack Daniels, his drink of choice, and stood at the window looking out at the lights. Jilly poured himself a scotch and sat on the leather couch. They talked about the show, about some improvements Frank wanted to make to the arrangements of certain songs, about scheduling for the next few weeks. Then Jilly brought up the subject he had been avoiding. "Frank, what do you really think about this Diamond kid? All the comparisons in the press, all the talk about rivalry, it's getting out of hand. You going to say something about it?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, took a sip of his drink, kept looking out at the lights. What Jilly didn't know was that someone else was in the penthouse, not in the room with them, but in the bedroom next door. One of the hotel staff, a maid who had come up to turn down the bed and prepare the room for the night. She had been taught to be invisible, to do her work quietly without disturbing the guests. When Frank and Jilly had come in, she had frozen in the bedroom, not wanting to interrupt their private conversation. She decided to wait until they left or went to another room. Then she would slip out unnoticed, but she couldn't help hearing their conversation through the open bedroom door. And what she heard next would become one of the most talked-about moments in music history, though it would be years before anyone knew about it. Frank finally spoke. "You want to know what I think about Neil Diamond? I'll tell you what I think. The man's a hell of a talent. He writes his own material, which is more than most of these pop singers can say. Sings with real emotion, not just technical skill, connects with his audience in a genuine way, and he's humble about it. Doesn't strut around acting like he's God's gift to music." Jilly was surprised. He had expected Frank to be dismissive or competitive. "This is not what you've been saying to the press. You've been kind of dismissive." Frank turned from the window. "That's because the press are idiots trying to create a fight where there isn't one. They want me to trash the kid so they can write a headline. I'm not giving them that satisfaction. But between you and me, Neil Diamond is the real deal." Frank walked over and sat in the chair across from Jilly, refilled both their glasses. "You know what the problem is with most young singers today? They're lazy. They want fame and money, but they don't want to put in the work. They don't study the craft. They don't learn how to really sing, how to interpret a lyric, how to build a show that takes the audience on a journey. Neil Diamond does all of that. The kid works his ass off." Jilly smiled. "So you respect him?" Frank nodded. "I respect the hell out of him. He reminds me of me when I was coming up. Hungry, dedicated, willing to do whatever it takes to be great. The difference is, he writes his own songs, and I never could. That gives him something I never had. Complete creative control." "But here's what kills me," Frank continued. "The press keeps asking if I'm threatened by him. Threatened? Why the hell would I be threatened? The music business isn't a zero-sum game. Him doing well doesn't mean I'm doing badly. There's room for both of us. There's room for 100 talented singers if they're good enough. The only people who think success is about knocking someone else down are people who've never actually been successful." Frank took another drink. "And you know what else? Neil Diamond makes my job easier. You know how? Because he's keeping the standards high. He's showing audiences what a real singer sounds like, what real songs sound like. In a world full of bubblegum pop and manufactured groups, he's doing something authentic, That raises the bar for everyone. That's good for the industry. That's good for me. Jilly leaned forward. You should tell him that. Tell him what you just told me. Frank shook his head. Why? So the press can make it into some big moment. Turn it into a publicity stunt. No. The kid doesn't need my approval. He's doing just fine on his own. And I don't need the press turning a private compliment into a three-ring circus. But you like his music, Jilly pressed. You actually listen to his records. Frank smiled, a real smile. Not the performance smile he gave audiences, but the genuine smile he reserved for friends. I'll tell you something I haven't told anyone. Last week I was in the car and Sweet Caroline came on the radio, and I turned it up, listened to the whole thing, and when it was over I thought to myself, that's a damn good song. Perfect for what it is. Simple, emotional, memorable. Everything a great song should be. Then Frank's expression became more serious. Here's what I respect most about Neil Diamond. He doesn't try to be me. He doesn't try to copy the Sinatra style or compete on my territory. He's found his own lane, his own voice, his own way of connecting with people. That takes guts. It would have been easy for him to try to be the next Sinatra or the next whoever. Instead, he became the first Neil Diamond. That's what you have to do if you want to last in this business. Jilly raised his glass. So the rivalry is all bullshit. Frank clinked his glass against Jilly's. Complete bullshit. Neil Diamond isn't my rival. He's my colleague. He's part of a tradition of great American popular singers. He's carrying the torch in his own way, for his own generation. I hope he has a long and successful career. The world needs more real singers, not fewer. In the bedroom, the maid stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe. She had just heard Frank Sinatra, the most powerful and sometimes feared man in entertainment, give one of the most generous and genuine compliments she had ever heard. This wasn't the public Sinatra, the one who could be cutting and cruel to people he didn't respect. This was the private Frank, the one who recognized and appreciated real talent when he saw it. The conversation moved on to other topics. After about 20 more minutes, Frank and Jilly left the penthouse to go down to the casino. The maid waited a few more minutes to be safe, then quickly finished her work and left. She told no one what she had heard. She was a professional, and what guests said in private was meant to stay private. But she never forgot that conversation, never forgot the respect in Frank Sinatra's voice when he talked about Neil Diamond. Meanwhile, Neil Diamond was having his own challenges with the rivalry narrative. He genuinely admired Frank Sinatra, had grown up listening to his records, considered him one of the greatest singers of all time. The last thing Neil wanted was to be seen as disrespectful or competitive towards someone he looked up to. But the press kept pushing, kept asking in every interview about Frank Sinatra, about the comparisons, about whether he thought he could compete with the legend. Neil's standard answer was always diplomatic. He would say there was no competition, that Sinatra was an icon who had paved the way for all popular singers, that he was just trying to do his own thing and not worry about comparisons. But privately it bothered him. He didn't want Frank Sinatra to think he was encouraging the rivalry narrative or trying to replace him or anything like that. It was a delicate situation. One night during his run at the Aladdin, Neil was in his dressing room after a show when there was a knock on the door. His manager answered it and came back with a surprised look on his face. "Neil, you have a visitor. It's Jilly Rizzo, Frank Sinatra's guy." Neil's heart jumped. Was Sinatra sending someone to confront him? To tell him to knock off the comparisons? To deliver some kind of message? Jilly came in and immediately put Neil at ease, smiled, shook his hand warmly. "Mr. Diamond, I just wanted to stop by and tell you that I caught your show tonight. You were tremendous. Really fantastic." Neil thanked him, still nervous about what this visit was really about. Jilly sat down. "Look, I'm not here on official business or anything. I just wanted to tell you that Frank and I were talking the other night. About you, about your music, about all the crap the press is stirring up." Neil braced himself. Jilly continued, "And Frank wanted me to let you know, quietly, without making a big thing of it, that he thinks you're terrific, thinks you're the real deal. Has a lot of respect for what you're doing." Neil was stunned. "Frank Sinatra said that about me?" Jilly nodded. "His exact words were that you're a hell of a talent, that you write your own material and sing with real emotion, that you're keeping the standards high. He's impressed with you, kid. Neil felt like he might cry. This was Frank Sinatra. The Frank Sinatra, saying he was impressed. It was more validation than 1,000 hit records or sold-out shows. Jilly saw the emotion on Neil's face and smiled. He also said you remind him of himself when he was younger, hungry, dedicated, willing to do the work. That's about the highest compliment Frank Sinatra gives anyone. Neil managed to speak. Why is he telling me this through you? Why not just... Jilly held up a hand. Because Frank doesn't want the press to make it into a circus. Doesn't want some big public moment where he endorses you and then everyone analyzes it to death. He respects you enough to tell you privately, artist to artist, without all the Hollywood nonsense. That's how Frank operates with people he actually respects. Neil understood. Can you tell him thank you? Tell him that means more to me than he probably knows. Jilly stood up. I'll tell him, and hey, keep doing what you're doing. Don't let the press comparisons get to you. You're not competing with Frank. You're doing your own thing, and you're doing it damn well. Jilly left, and Neil sat in his dressing room for a long time, overwhelmed with gratitude and relief. The story might have ended there. A private compliment delivered through a trusted friend, appreciated by the recipient, and never spoken of publicly. But secrets have a way of coming out eventually. 10 years later, in 1981, Jilly Rizzo gave an interview to a music magazine. The interview was mostly about his long friendship with Sinatra, stories from the road, memories of the glory days of Vegas. Near the end, the interviewer asked about the supposed rivalry between Sinatra and Neil Diamond back in the early 70s. Jilly laughed. Rivalry? There was never any rivalry except in the minds of journalists who needed something to write about. Frank loved Neil Diamond, thought he was one of the best singers of his generation. The interviewer pressed for details. Jilly, figuring enough time had passed and that it was a positive story, told about the conversation in the penthouse, told what Frank had said about Neil's talent, his work ethic, his authenticity. The interviewer was shocked. Frank Sinatra said all that? Why didn't he say it publicly, Jilly explained. Because Frank was a private guy when it came to real emotions. The public Sinatra was confident, sometimes cocky, always in control. But the private Frank was more thoughtful, more generous, more vulnerable. He didn't like showing that side to the world, but he showed it to the people he trusted. And through me, he showed it to Neil Diamond. The magazine article came out, and the music world was stunned. Here was confirmation that Frank Sinatra, the king of American popular music, had privately praised Neil Diamond in the warmest possible terms, had called him a hell of a talent, had compared him favorably to himself. The story was picked up by newspapers and other magazines, became one of those legendary music industry anecdotes that gets told and retold. Neil Diamond was asked about it in interviews. He confirmed that Jilly had visited him in 1971 and delivered Frank's message, confirmed that it had meant the world to him, had given him confidence at a crucial time in his career. He spoke about it with obvious emotion, with gratitude that never diminished over the years. That was one of the greatest moments of my professional life, Neil said in an interview in 1982. Having someone like Frank Sinatra, someone I admired so much, respect my work, it validated everything I was trying to do. Frank Sinatra himself, when asked about it, didn't deny anything, smiled and said, yeah, I told Jilly that. The Diamond Kid's got talent, always did, but you know, I didn't say it for publicity. I said it because it was true. That's Frank. Even when confirming a compliment, keeping it low-key, keeping it real. What made the story even more beautiful was what happened later. In 1983, Frank Sinatra was putting together a television special celebrating his musical career. He had the power to choose any guest stars he wanted, and one of the people he chose was Neil Diamond. They performed a duet together, The House I Live In, a song about America that both of them loved. Watching them sing together, you could see the mutual respect, the genuine warmth. Two great artists from different generations, connected by their love of music and their commitment to excellence. After Frank Sinatra died in 1998, Neil Diamond spoke at length about what Frank had meant to him, talked about that night in 1971 when Jilly delivered the message, said it had changed his life, had given him confidence to keep pushing forward, to keep being himself rather than trying to be anyone else. Frank Sinatra taught me that success isn't about competing with others, Neil said. It's about being the best version of yourself. He could have seen me as competition. Instead, he saw me as a colleague. That generosity of spirit is what made him not just a great singer, but a great man. The maid who overheard the conversation. She eventually told her story too, decades later when she was retired. Confirmed everything that Jilly had said. Talked about how moved she had been to hear the private Frank Sinatra, the real man behind the legend, speak with such genuine respect about a younger artist. It was beautiful, she said in an interview in 2005. You hear all these stories about Frank Sinatra being tough and intimidating, and I'm sure he could be. But what I heard that night was someone who loved music more than ego. Someone who could recognize and appreciate greatness in others without feeling threatened. What do you think about this story? Have you ever received unexpected validation from someone you admired? Share your experiences in the comments below. This story of what Frank Sinatra secretly said about Neil Diamond teaches us profound lessons. It teaches us that real confidence doesn't feel threatened by other people's success. That true greatness can acknowledge and celebrate the greatness of others. That private generosity is more meaningful than public praise. That the music industry's obsession with rivalries and competition often misses the real story of mutual respect and admiration between artists. Frank Sinatra could have been dismissive of Neil Diamond, could have seen him as a threat, a young upstart trying to take his crown. The press certainly tried to frame it that way. But Frank was secure enough, talented enough, successful enough to recognize that Neil Diamond's success didn't diminish his own, that there was room for multiple great singers, that the rising tide lifts all boats. He thought no one was listening, what Frank Sinatra secretly said about Neil Diamond. And when the truth came out, it revealed the character of both men. Frank's generosity and wisdom, Neil's humility and gratitude. Two legends treating each other with respect and dignity. That's how it should be. That's how greatness recognizes greatness.